On the coast of Maine, veteran Jake Carson and his dog Ranger made a modest living dismantling old ships. Their newest job, the SS Meridian, a corroded World War II tugboat, was supposed to be routine. Instead, it revealed a secret vault, lost gold, and a truth that had slept for 80 years. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. Jake Carson had stopped believing in second chances a long time ago. The wars had stripped that out of him, first overseas, then inside his own head. Now, at 48, he lived on the quiet edges of Clearwater, Maine, a harbor town where gulls screamed louder than people spoke. The ocean was both his refuge and his reminder. Each dawn he poured black coffee into a chipped Navy mug and stared at the rust-colored horizon. His only companion was Ranger, a 10-year-old German shepherd with a white muzzle and eyes that had seen too much. They were two veterans of different kinds. One carried medals in a drawer, the other carried scars behind his fur. Ranger limped slightly on his left leg, a remnant from the explosion that had ended their final mission together. When thunder rolled across the bay, both would flinch the same way. Jake's life had narrowed to something simple, stripping old ships for steel, not noble, but it kept his mind quiet. That morning, a call came from an auction yard down the coast. A decommissioned World War II tugboat was being sold off for scrap. The SS Meridian. 52 tons of rust and a name that sounded like it had once mattered. When Jake arrived, the fog still clung to the harbor like a secret. The ship sat half-sunken in its cradle, its hull streaked with orange and salt. "You sure you want this one?" the yard manager asked. "Been sitting here since my father was a kid. Probably more ghosts than metal." Jake smirked faintly. Ghosts don't pay in cash. Steel does. He handed over a weathered envelope filled with bills, and a last bit of savings from a Navy pension, and 2 smaller ships stripped bare. As the paperwork changed hands, Ranger sat by his feet, tail still, eyes fixed on the vessel. The dog's ears twitched forward, then flattened. Jake noticed. Easy boy. Just a pile of rust. But even as he said it, a chill moved through him. The tugboat loomed silent, its name barely visible under layers of decay. SS Meridian. They started work that afternoon. Jake guided his old flatbed truck closer to the dock, winched a line, and stepped aboard for the first time. The deck groaned beneath his boots. The air smelled of diesel and old rain. Ranger followed halfway up the ramp, then froze, growling low in his throat. Jake turned. "Come on." Ranger didn't move. His tail dropped. He barked once, sharp a warning, not defiance. Jake sighed, rubbed the back of his neck. "Fine. Stay there, coward." He tried to sound amused, but something inside him tightened. He'd spent years reading danger before it spoke. The silence here felt wrong, not empty, but waiting. Inside the narrow corridors were a graveyard of metal. Every step echoed through hollow passageways. Dust drifted like ash. In the mess hall, cups still hung on hooks welded in place by time. Jake brushed one with his glove. It left a clean circle on the wall, a pale reminder that someone once stood here drinking, laughing maybe. He paused by a porthole. Outside, Ranger paced to the dock, whining softly. "What's gotten into you, boy?" he muttered. But the truth was, the dog was only voicing what Jake refused to admit. This ship didn't feel dead. It felt suspended, like a breath held too long. He descended toward the engine room, flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. The air grew heavier with the smell of oil and salt. Somewhere, a droplet of water tapped rhythmically. Tick, 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 like a clock counting down. When he reached the lower deck, a faint sound answered him. Not metal shifting, not water leaking, something deeper, a vibration in the hull, low enough to be felt more than heard. He frowned. Must be the tide hitting the dock. Still, his pulse quickened. Back on deck, he tried to laugh it off. Ranger met him halfway down the ramp, pushing his nose against Jake's hand, whining with urgency. Yeah, we'll head home," Jake murmured. He cast one last look at the SS Meridian, silhouetted against the dying light. The ship seemed to absorb the sunset instead of reflecting it, as if swallowing color itself. That night, over a simple dinner of canned stew, Jake replayed the day in his head. He had dealt with enough wrecks to know when something didn't add up. A tugboat from the 1940s never fully dismantled, sitting unsold for decades while he reached down to scratch Ranger's ear. The dog's fur bristled slightly at the mention of the ship's name, as though the word itself carried static. "We'll check her engine room tomorrow," Jake said aloud, mostly to himself. "Then we'll see what kind of ghosts you're afraid of." Ranger's eyes met his solemn, unblinking. Jake forced a small smile, but his voice softened. "Don't look at me like that. It's just steel and bolts." But when the lights flickered and the old clock on the wall stopped ticking, he realized he'd been holding his breath. Outside, through the cracked window, the fog had rolled back in thicker now, pressing against the glass like something alive. And out there, faint and steady, came the deep, hollow groan of metal bending. As if the ship had exhaled, the next morning broke gray and wet. Rain streaked the harbor like threads of smoke, the kind that never fully clears. Jake parked his truck beside the dock, steam rising from the exhaust into the chill air. Ranger jumped down first, shook the water off his fur, and stood staring at the SS Meridian. The ship loomed over them, silent, hulking and indifferent to the years it had slept. Jake adjusted his jacket and exhaled. "Come on, buddy," he said softly, his voice half comfort, half command. "Let's get this done." The deck was slick with algae. Each step left faint boot prints that vanished under the mist. The air smelled of iron and salt, the same scent that had followed Jake since the Navy. He unhooked his tool belt and started the generator. The engine coughed to life, echoing down the empty harbor. Ranger flinched at the sound, then settled beside the ramp, watchful. Inside the engine room, Jake's flashlight carved through the gloom. The place felt like a cathedral of forgotten machinery, pipes crisscrossing overhead valves sealed with corrosion, and cables drooping like cobwebs. He crouched near the massive main engine block, a structure so big it seemed fused to the ship's bones. His gloved hand brushed against a smaller tank attached to the side wall, smooth metal strangely unscarred. He frowned. The rest of the room was aged beyond repair, but this tank looked newer. Its surface was painted in dull gray, no rust, no dents, just a faint smell of burnt oil. He rapped on it with a wrench. The sound came back solid and heavy, not hollow. "That's odd," he murmured. He traced the weld line around its edges. The seams were tight and clean, far better than the rough patchwork of the original design. Whoever added this piece knew what they were doing. He stepped back, squinting. The tank was too thick to be a replacement fuel line and too small to serve as a ballast. A retrofit, maybe. But for what? Ranger barked once, sharp and uneasy. Jake glanced over his shoulder. The dog stood on the stairs, ears pinned, eyes fixed on the tank. "It's fine," Jake said, though his voice carried less certainty than he intended. Ranger growled low, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the floor. Jake hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded blueprints he had salvaged from the ship's bridge the day before. The paper was brittle, yellowed with salt, and smelled faintly of mold. He spread it over the nearby workbench and ran a finger along the schematic. There was no notation for an auxiliary fuel tank in that location, nothing even close. His eyes narrowed. Someone had modified the Meridian after those plans were drawn. But why would anyone update an old tugboat like this and then abandon it? He checked the welds again. The work wasn't just good, it was professional military even. He felt a small chill work its way down his spine. "This thing doesn't belong here," he muttered. Ranger barked again, louder this time. Jake turned irritation, flashing briefly before fading into concern. "What is it, huh?" The dog backed a step toward the hatch, tail low, ears flicking. For a second, Jake could almost feel what Ranger felt, a vibration underfoot, faint but steady, like the hum of something alive. He crouched beside the tank, pressed his ear against the cool metal. Nothing, only the faraway sound of rain hitting steel. He tapped the metal. Not hollow, something was inside. He imagined a solid mass, maybe machinery sealed inside, but the tank was too clean, too perfect. No grime, no smell of residue, no sign it had ever held fuel. "You've been sealed up tight for a long time, haven't you?" he whispered. He straightened, wiped sweat from his brow, and looked around the dim chamber. The flashlight beam slid across the walls, catching fragments of names scratched into the paint initials, dates, maybe crew markings. Some were decades old, faded almost to nothing. One set caught his eye, EM etched deep near the tank's base. The letters were deliberate, carved by someone who wanted them found. Jake felt the old ache behind his ribs, that prickling sense that things weren't what they seemed. The war had left him with instincts sharper than comfort. Every hum, every shadow, every silence, they all meant something. He touched the initials again. "Who were you, EM?" he said quietly. Ranger whined behind him, pacing. The air felt thicker now, like the ship was holding its breath. Jake folded the blueprint, carefully slid it into his jacket pocket, and stepped back from the tank. He could feel the question tightening in his chest. Why would anyone hide something inside a place no one was meant to open? Rain hammered the hull as if the sea itself was knocking to be let in. Jake shut off the generator, plunging the engine room into dim silence. The only light came from his small flashlight, trembling slightly in his hand. "We'll come back tomorrow," he said, more to himself than to Ranger. "Bring the cutting torch. See what's behind you, old friend." He turned to leave, boots clanging softly on the steel floor. Ranger followed, close tail brushing against his leg. As they climbed toward the deck, Jake glanced over his shoulder one last time. The beam of his light swept across the tank, catching the faint reflection of something just beneath the surface, a subtle dent shaped almost like a handprint pressed from the inside. He froze, heart thudding once hard. The flashlight flickered, then went out. By the third morning, the fog had lifted, but the air felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. Jake arrived early, before the harbor stirred to life. The SS Meridian sat half-shrouded in mist, its reflection trembling on the water. He brought the cutting torch, a small acetylene rig that hissed when he tested the line. Ranger stayed close, but silent ears tilted back, watching every move. The dog had refused to enter the ship the day before, but when Jake called softly, he followed him aboard, pause, hesitant on the slick deck. "Just another day, partner," Jake said under his breath, not sure whether he was talking to the dog or to himself. Inside the engine room, it smelled the same oil rust and damp metal, but now there was something sharper, almost sour, that hadn't been there before. Jake lowered his tools beside the tank. The steel surface was cold to the touch, colder than the surrounding air. He could see his reflection distorted in it, tired eyes, graying beard, the outline of a man who had learned to keep his distance from hope. He fastened his goggles, struck the torch, and watched the blue-white flame leap alive. The light filled the chamber with flickering shadows. When the torch met the steel, the air crackled. Sparks hissed and scattered like fireflies caught in wind. The smell of old fuel rose instantly, thick, bitter, almost alive. Ranger backed up the stairs, barking once the sound sharp against the walls. "Easy boy," Jake called, though the dog's instinct seemed wiser than his own. He steadied his hand and kept cutting. The metal fought him. It wasn't the usual corroded softness of a forgotten hull. It was dense, deliberate. Whoever welded it had meant for it to stay closed forever. Sweat gathered under Jake's goggles, tracing down his temple despite the chill. He moved slowly, drawing a square outline near the upper edge, each pass of the torch releasing a shower of sparks that hissed when they hit the wet floor. The hiss blended with the Ranger's low growl, a rhythm that made the air pulse with tension. Then the flame sliced through to something smoother beneath. Jake leaned closer, narrowing his eyes. The interior wall gleamed faintly brighter than the outer layer. He shut off the torch, the sudden silence loud in his ears. The ship creaked as if shifting its weight. He tapped the new surface gently with the wrench. The sound came back sharp and shallow. A double wall. He blinked, realization dawning, slow and cold. "This isn't a fuel tank," he whispered. "It's a partition." He retrieved a pry bar and wedged it into the seam he had just cut. Metal resisted, then gave with a sigh. When he pulled the small section free, a rush of stale air escaped, dry and chemical, as if sealed away from time itself. He lifted the flashlight and aimed it inside. What he saw didn't make sense at first. The interior was lined with layers of thick canvas coated in wax and oil, perfectly preserved. The space was no bigger than a closet, maybe 4 feet deep, but the walls were clean, uncorroded, untouched by salt. It was as if the sea had never existed here. In the beam's center sat 3 wooden crates stacked neatly on top of each other. Their corners were reinforced with brass fittings still gleaming faintly. A faint smell of varnish mixed with the dust drifted out. Jake's heartbeat slowed, heavy and deliberate. He swallowed hard. What in the world? His voice trailed off. He lowered the flashlight, half expecting the image to vanish when the light moved away, but it didn't. He leaned closer, careful not to disturb anything. The crates bore faint government stencils, numbers blurred by age. 412, A412B, 412C. The handwriting across the top was smaller, hand-scrawled in fading pencil, Meridian Manifest EM. He traced the initials with a gloved finger. They matched the ones carved near the tank's base. Ranger whined from the stairs, his claws clicking nervously on metal. Jake looked back. "It's all right," he said softly. "We found something." But he didn't sound convinced. He could feel the air shifting again, the strange stillness that comes right before a storm breaks. He thought of his Navy days, the missions that began with quiet discovery and ended with things that couldn't be unseen. His pulse climbed. The crates looked heavy. The wood was old but intact, sealed with iron nails that had not rusted. No moisture, no decay. The precision was unnatural. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide this. Jake's flashlight beam drifted along the back wall. A faint engraving caught his eye letters barely visible under the wax. "For the one who listens." He blinked, unsure if his mind was playing tricks. Listens to what he whispered. When he raised the light again, glare on the waxed steel washed the markings out, leaving only smooth metal behind. He sat back on his heels, exhaling. Ranger gave a low, questioning whine. "Yeah, I see it too," Jake murmured. He reached forward, rested a hand on the first crate. The wood was cool and dry, the kind of dryness that only comes from long darkness. Something about the touch made his stomach tighten, a quiet certainty that whatever rested inside wasn't meant to see daylight again. The ship creaked above, a sound deep enough to feel through his boots. Ranger barked once more, louder this time. Jake turned toward the noise, instinctively scanning the narrow corridor beyond the engine room. Nothing moved. Only shadows swaying with the slow rhythm of the water below. He looked back into the hidden chamber. The light flickered as the generator sputtered. For a brief second, the reflection of his flashlight caught something metallic between the crates, something that glimmered gold before disappearing again into the dark. Jake worked in silence, the kind of silence that presses against the ears until every breath sounds too loud. The crates stood before him like sleeping animals, unmarked except for the faded stencils. He hesitated, glancing toward the stairs where Ranger waited, tail still head tilted. "Guess we're doing this," Jake murmured, voice low and steady. He wedged the crowbar under the lid of the first crate and leaned his weight into it. The wood groaned before giving way with a reluctant snap. A puff of stale air escaped, carrying a faint metallic scent. He aimed his flashlight inside. What he saw made his pulse falter. Stacks of brittle yellow paper filled the box from edge to edge, old currency banded in decaying strings. Mixed between them were small rectangular bars, their dull surfaces catching the light in muted glints. He picked one up carefully. It was heavier than it looked. The engraving was faint, but clear enough. U.S. Mint, 1945. Bars stamped that year often moved under post-war reconstruction programs, which made the Meridian's manifest plausible. The numbers beneath were clean, untouched by corrosion. Jake stared at the gold for a long moment, unable to breathe properly. "Ranger," he whispered, half laughing, half in disbelief. "This can't be real." The dog answered with a soft whine, pacing closer but refusing to step across the threshold. Jake lowered the bar, the weight cold in his hands. The first crate alone could buy everything he owned many times over. He set it aside and reached for the second. This one was sealed more carefully, the nails driven flush into the wood. He pried each one loose with deliberate patience, afraid that rushing might break the fragile illusion of discovery. When the lid came off, a thin layer of paper dust rose into the air, shimmering in the flashlight's beam. Inside, he found bundles of old silver certificates, each printed with ornate patterns, the ink still vivid despite the years. Beneath them lay several folded envelopes wrapped in lead foil. He unwrapped one corner, revealing sheets of official-looking paper bonds, deeds, records, documents that looked both priceless and forbidden. The handwriting along the margins was neat, purposeful. The name Department of Naval Transport appeared more than once, stamped with a seal that made Jake's chest tighten. He was looking at something that was never meant to be seen again. He paused, leaning back on his heels. The realization came slow but heavy. This wasn't treasure stolen by pirates or smugglers. This was government property, lost, hidden, or worse, buried deliberately. He rubbed his temple, trying to steady his thoughts. The third crate waited in the corner, darker. Heavier, the nails rusted deep. He hesitated before touching it. "Last one," he murmured. "Then we figure out what the hell this is." He pried the edges, each creak echoing through the chamber. When the lid finally came free, it revealed something different. No money this time. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age, and several folders wrapped in wax paper, each marked with a red stamp, "Classified." Jake reached for the journal first. It felt fragile, but alive, like it had been waiting for someone to open it. The first page was dated June 12, 1945. The handwriting was firm, the ink slightly faded, but still readable. "To whoever finds this, know that I did not act out of greed." Jake read aloud under his breath. His throat felt dry. "I was given an order I could not obey. We were to deliver assets, gold currency securities, to European reconstruction offices. But I have seen what men do with power. The cargo was destined not for rebuilding, but for corruption." He flipped another page, scanning quickly. "I made the choice to hide what could not be trusted. I sealed it within the heart of my ship, where no one would look, a place disguised as decay." The entry ended abruptly, followed by pages filled with meticulous notes, coordinates, inventories, coded symbols. At the bottom of one page, the signature curved in elegant ink, "Captain Elias Monroe, SS Meridian." Jake's breath caught. "Monroe," he said softly, testing the name aloud as if it might wake something in the walls. The dog's ears twitched at the sound. Ranger whimpered once, as though sensing the gravity of it. Jake thumbed through more pages, each one a blend of confession and technical precision. The captain wrote about the war, about how he had watched convoys sink and men vanish for causes that changed with every headline. His words carried the quiet desperation of someone who had seen too much and trusted too little. One passage made Jake pause. "If they find me before I return, they will call me a traitor, but history is written by those who bury the truth deepest." Jake swallowed hard, feeling the weight of those words settle like stone in his chest. He traced the embossed initials on the cover, EM, the same ones carved into the steel beside the tank. Suddenly, the air around him felt heavier. The ship's timbers creaked a sound like breath drawn through old lungs. Ranger barked softly, tail-tucked eyes on the open crates. Jake set the journal aside and exhaled slowly. "You were trying to protect something, weren't you, Captain?" he murmured. "Or someone." He looked again at the layers of gold and currency, the silent evidence of a secret buried longer than his lifetime. For the first time since he'd boarded the Meridian, Jake felt less like a salvager and more like an intruder. He leaned forward, closing the journal gently. The metal underfoot thrummed faintly, as though something deeper in the ship had stirred in its sleep. Jake sat on the cold steel floor, the three crates open like wounds around him. The beam of his flashlight trembled as it flickered across the gold bars, the brittle stacks of money, the journal lying where he had left it. The air in the engine room felt heavier now, not just with the smell of oil and rust, but with the weight of choice. He rubbed his forehead, trying to slow the pounding in his temples. For years, life had been about survival, fixing engines, selling scrap, keeping Ranger fed, keeping the nightmares quiet. Now, in a single moment, everything had changed. He He stared at the gold the way it caught the dim light and reflected it like sunlight on water. It was the kind of secret that never stayed buried. Millions, he whispered. More than I could ever count. His voice sounded strange in the narrow space smaller than he remembered. Ranger lay a few feet away, curled near the base of the stairs, his breathing slow and uneven. The old dog lifted his head when Jake spoke, eyes cloudy but still aware. "You hear me," Boy Jake said, forcing a weak laugh. "If we kept this, we'd never have to chase another job again. You'd have your medicine, your soft bed." I'd. He stopped the words, dissolving into the stale air. Ranger blinked once, then turned his head away, resting his muzzle back on his paws. The message was silent but clear. Jake exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his beard. "You always were the honest one," he muttered. He pushed himself to his feet, pacing the narrow room. Each step echoed against the hole, a hollow sound that seemed to ask its own question. "What are you going to do?" He looked again at the journal open to a page where Monroe's handwriting slanted across the yellowed paper. "I did not hide this for myself, but for what I still believe is right." Jake swallowed. He'd known men like that, soldiers who carried the line between duty and doubt like a burden they could never put down. He had been one of them once, before the world blurred those lines beyond recognition. He sat on the crate head, bowed. "You did the right thing," he said softly to the absent captain. "You tried to stop something you couldn't control." The words tasted bitter. Wasn't that what he'd told himself all those years ago when orders went wrong, when people got hurt, that he was just following the right path? But right had cost him everything: friends, family, faith. Now, here he was, staring at a fortune large enough to rewrite his future, maybe even his past. He imagined what it could mean: paying off the debts, fixing the old house, giving Ranger the care he deserved. Maybe buying a small marina where the days ended quietly, without the sound of gunfire in his head. It wasn't greed, it was peace, wasn't it? He caught himself thinking in circles the way he used to when fear crept in before a mission. That same danger filled him now, not from bullets, but temptation. The silence around him thickened until even the ship seemed to be listening. He turned off the flashlight, sitting in the dark with only the faint outline of gold glinting in the dim light leaking from the deck above. The glow looked alive, like something breathing. "You know," he said quietly, "maybe this is how it happens. A man tells himself one lie, just one, and it feels almost noble. Then another, until he's standing in the dark, pretending it's light." Ranger stirred, shifting his weight, then gave a low sigh that broke the silence. Jake smiled faintly, a tired, fragile curve of his lips. "Yeah, I hear you," he said. "You wouldn't touch a bone that wasn't yours. Guess I should take a note from you." He stood turning toward the stairs when a gust of cold air swept through the engine room. The ship creaked, groaned, and somewhere deep within its steel ribs something shuddered. It was a sound like breath drawn through a throat that hadn't breathed in years. Jake froze, every nerve alert. The lights flickered. The air smelled suddenly sharper, metallic. He turned slowly, scanning the shadows. "Hello," his voice echoed once, swallowed by the dark. Nothing answered, but he could swear he heard it faint, distant, like a whisper carried through the pipes. He strained to listen, heart pounding. There's another secret. In the heart of the ship. The words weren't loud, but they slid through the silence like a current, real enough to raise goosebumps on his arms. He stepped back instinctively, eyes darting to the open crates, then to the sealed bulkhead beyond the main engine. The sound was gone now, replaced by the slow drip of water and Ranger's soft breathing. Jake's mouth had gone dry. "You hear that?" he whispered, but the dog didn't move. For a long time he stood there, staring at the dark wall where the sound had come from. His pulse slowly steadied, but the unease stayed. He looked once more at the gold, the journal, the hollow steel beyond. Maybe the whisper was memory, or the ship's unfinished story. He knelt, packed the journal carefully back into its crate, then sat beside Ranger. The dog's head rested on his knee, and Jake felt the familiar comfort of that weight, steady and real. He stroked Ranger's fur, absently, eyes fixed on the shadows of the engine room. Tomorrow, he murmured more to himself than to the dog. Tomorrow, we find out what else you're hiding. The ship groaned again, a low resonant sound that seemed almost like a reply. The next morning, the sky hung low and gray, pressing its weight over the harbor. The wind had turned colder overnight, carrying the scent of rain and rust. Jake moved slowly, his body stiff from another sleepless night. He and Ranger reached the meridian, just as dawn broke the first sliver of light glancing off the ship's weathered hull. The air was still enough to hear the creak of every mooring line, the faint groan of the old tugboat shifting against its ropes. Jake climbed aboard with his tools, feeling the wood give slightly underfoot. Ranger followed reluctant but obedient, his claws tapping against the deck. The engine room greeted them like a memory, dark-heavy and unchanged. The crates sat where he had left them, silent and untouched. Jake's flashlight beam drifted toward the far wall where the massive engine block rose a maze of iron and shadow. The heart of the ship, he murmured. The whisper from the night before still echoed in his head. There's another secret, in the heart of the ship. He wasn't sure anymore if it had been a dream or something else. Either way, it had brought him back here. He crouched near the base of the main engine. The machinery loomed above him like the rib cage of some ancient beast, its pipes and valves twisted together in a dense, silent snarl. He slid his gloved hand along the side, feeling for seams, inconsistencies, anything that didn't belong. At first, there was nothing, just cold metal and old grime, but then his fingers brushed over something smoother, flatter. He leaned closer, brushing away the dust. A rectangular shape appeared, a small metal box no larger than a shoebox fused directly into the engine's body. "What are you?" Jake whispered. He aimed the flashlight closer. The welds around the edges were cleaner than the surrounding steel, newer by decades. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide this piece. He fetched a small chisel and hammer from his kit, tapping carefully along the seam. The echo was faint hollow on one side, but solid on the other. With each strike, Ranger's ears flicked back, his tail twitching nervously. The dog let out a low growl that vibrated through the stillness. "Easy," Jake murmured. "Just metal, that's all." But his voice lacked conviction. After several careful taps, the weld cracked. He pried the box free, the sound sharp against the silence. The steel was heavier than he expected. He set it down on the floor, the clang echoing like a gunshot in the confined space. Ranger flinched, letting out a quiet whine. Jake crouched beside the box, wiping away a layer of dust. The surface bore no markings except for a single engraved initial EM. His stomach tightened. "Monroe," he whispered. His hands trembled slightly as he worked the latch open. It stuck at first, then released with a dry click. The lid creaked up, revealing a small compartment packed with yellowed documents and a cylindrical object wrapped in cloth. Jake unwrapped it slowly, expecting perhaps another stash of gold or artifacts. But the cloth peeled back to reveal something entirely different. A small detonator, its wires coiled neatly around a central trigger. The metal gleamed dull gray, aged but intact. Jake froze. For a long moment, he didn't breathe. The device looked old, maybe mid-century, but not harmless. He had seen ones like it before, improvised charges built into old engines designed to destroy evidence, not enemies. The type that didn't care who was nearby when it went off. He set it down gently and shifted the papers beneath. Bonds stamped in German and French marked with banks long since defunct. Stocks and bearer certificates, each worth a fortune in their time. He thumbed through the stack and among them found a folded envelope, brittle and sealed with wax. The seal had cracked over time. He eased it open. Inside a letter written in looping ink. "If you find this, you must be careful. They will come again, as they always do." A powerful organization, one that profits from chaos, has hidden its hand in this mission. I could not destroy what they sent, but I could hide it where their greed would not reach. The device ensures silence. I beg you, whoever you are, do not dismantle this ship. Let it rest, let the sea hold its secrets. Signed neatly beneath the final line, Elias Monroe. Jake's mouth went dry. He read the words twice, then a third time, as if repetition might change them. His pulse thudded in his ears. A device ensures silence, he muttered under his breath. He turned his gaze toward the detonator again, the realization sinking in fast and cold. This wasn't some relic, it was part of the ship's heart, still connected, still dangerous. His hand tightened around the letter until the paper crackled. Ranger barked, suddenly sharp and urgent. Jake flinched, nearly dropping the box. "What is it?" he asked, but then he heard it too, a faint rhythmic hum beneath the deck. It was barely audible but unmistakable. The engine wasn't alive. Air moving through the conduits and the generator's vibration were making the bundled wires buzz like a tuning fork. He crouched lower, placing his ear near the hull. The vibration was real. It wasn't the engine itself. The wiring was resonating from ambient vibration and induced current. The detonator could still be sensitive. He pulled back, heart hammering. His training kicked in assess, contain, isolate. He needed to leave call someone who knew what they were doing. But his eyes fell again on the gold bars stacked nearby the journal, the history that seemed to breathe in this place. The thought that one wrong move could erase it all, could erase him, clawed at the back of his mind. He turned the letter over in his hands. The ink had bled faintly through the page, forming a shadow of the same warning, "Do not dismantle." Ranger growled again, backing toward the stairs. Jake took a step after him, then paused. He looked back at the engine block, at the small scar of missing metal where the box had been. The hum was still there, faint but steady. Somewhere deep in the ship, a drop of water fell one, then another, steady as a heartbeat. Jake exhaled, his breath clouding the air. "All right," he whispered, half to Ranger, half to the ghost of Elias Monroe. "Let's not wake it up." He set the letter back inside the box and began to retreat slowly toward the light above, careful not to disturb the wires glinting beneath his feet. The ship seemed to sigh as he moved, as if acknowledging what he had just learned. Jake spent the rest of that morning pacing the deck of the Meridian, every nerve stretched tight. The letter from Captain Monroe weighed in his pocket like an anchor, and the image of the detonator burned in his mind. The fog had thinned, leaving the harbor strangely quiet. He could hear the distant call of gulls and the soft slap of water against the hull. Ranger followed him closely, his tail-low eyes fixed on his owner, as if sensing that something irreversible was about to happen. Jake stopped near the bow, took a deep breath, and looked down at his trembling hands. Jake had made decisions under fire before, but none that felt like this, history and danger intertwined. He took out his phone, scrolled through the faded list of contacts he barely used anymore, and stopped at one Lieutenant Commander Allen, U.S. Naval Records Division. The man had once been his superior, the only officer who still answered his calls. Jake hesitated, thumb hovering over the number. He thought about the gold, the bonds, the endless possibilities. Then he thought about the letter, the warning, and the soft, steady loyalty of the dog at his side. He pressed the button. The call connected after a few rings. "Alan here?" The voice on the other end was older now, gruffer, but still carried authority. Jake cleared his throat. "Sir, it's Carson. Jake Carson." A pause. "Carson. Been a while. You all right?" Jake looked at the ship, the open hatch leading down into the engine room, the faint glint of something hidden in the dark. "I need to report something big and dangerous." He explained everything, keeping his voice even, detailing the discovery, the crates, the gold, the detonator, the letter. Alan interrupted only once when Jake mentioned Monroe's name. "Elias Monroe," he said sharply. "That can't be. He stopped himself, his tone shifting. "All right, Jake, don't touch anything else. Do you hear me? Stay where you are. I'll make some calls." By late afternoon, 2 black SUVs rolled into the dockyard. The men who stepped out weren't the usual locals. Their suits were pressed, their expressions controlled. One introduced himself as Agent Pierce from the Naval History and Heritage Command, another as Chief Petty Officer Kelly from Navy Explosive Ordnance Disposal. They listened to Jake's account with professional calm, though he could see the flicker of disbelief and interest in their eyes. Pierce identified jurisdiction for historical custody, while Kelly stated EOD would assume responsibility for render-safe procedures. When he showed them the journal and the letter, that disbelief turned to focus. They examined the photos he had taken of the detonator, the documents, the crates. "We'll need to secure the site," Pierce said finally. You understand this is federal property now, Mr. Carson? Jake nodded, feeling both relieved and hollow. I'm not asking for anything, just make sure it's handled right. The agent gave a curt nod and motioned to the technicians waiting near the vehicles. Within an hour, the area around the Meridian was cordoned off. Bright yellow tape fluttered in the wind, and warning signs were nailed to the dock posts. Ranger stood beside Jake the whole time, watching the strangers come and go, his body tense but quiet. The dog didn't like the noise, the movement, the smell of new boots on old wood. Jake sat on an overturned crate watching the bomb team vanish into the hatch, their cautious voices echoing up the steel corridors. He clasped his hands together, then reached down and gripped Ranger's collar. The leather was worn smooth from years of use. His thumb found the groove where the nameplate had been polished dull. "Easy, boy," he whispered. "They'll take care of it." But his heart didn't believe it. Hours passed. The sun dipped lower, staining the harbor water a dull orange. Jake hadn't moved. He sat with his elbows on his knees, head bowed, staring at the reflection of the ship in the rippling waves. Ranger pressed close to him, resting his head against Jake's leg. Every few minutes, a muffled sound came from inside the ship, metal shifting faint voices, the soft ping of tools. The agents spoke quietly nearby, their radios murmuring updates Jake couldn't fully hear. He didn't ask questions. He just waited. At one point, Agent Pierce approached. "Mr. Carson, the team says you did the right thing. That thing inside the engine, it's real and it's unstable. You might have saved a lot of lives by not trying to move it." Jake managed a nod, his throat too tight to speak. "Can I stay?" he asked after a moment. The agent hesitated, then sighed. "Stay by the dock, but keep clear." The light faded, and flood lamps came on, bathing the old tugboat in harsh white. The shadows moved like restless ghosts along the deck. Jake sat still, gripping Ranger's collar as if it were an anchor holding him in place. He found himself whispering not to the agents, not even to himself, but to the ship. "You can rest now," he said softly. "They'll take care of it." Ranger stirred his ears, twitching at a sudden clang from below deck. Jake's body tensed, breath catching. Then came a voice over the radio, calm but firm. "We've located the device. Beginning disarmament." The words echoed faintly across the water. Jake closed his eyes and held onto the dog fingers tightening in the worn leather. The night air turned cold. Each sound from the ship felt louder now, the distant metallic scrape, the hiss of oxygen lines, the hum of machinery. Time lost its meaning. Jake thought of Monroe, of the choice he had made to bury the truth rather than let it be corrupted. He wondered if every man who ever wore a uniform reached this point where doing the right thing meant letting go of everything else. He bowed his head, whispering something that wasn't quite a prayer, just a quiet promise to the past. The ship groaned once more, a deep resonant sound that rolled through the dock like thunder trapped beneath the waves. Jake didn't move. He sat perfectly still, his hand resting on Ranger's collar, eyes fixed on the dark outline of the SS Meridian as the lights inside flickered like distant lightning. 2 days passed in a haze of tension that clung to every sound and breath. The dock had turned into a fortress lined with yellow tape and guarded vehicles. Floodlights bathed the SS Meridian in a cold, relentless glow that made her look less like a ship and more like a memory being dissected. Jake barely left the pier during that time. He slept, sitting up against a piling, his jacket pulled around him, Ranger curled close at his side. Each night the air vibrated with faint noises from inside the hull, metal being cut tools, scraping voices murmuring through radios. No one told him much, but he didn't ask. He knew enough to understand that silence meant progress, and progress meant danger was still alive somewhere in that engine room. On the third morning, the sky was clear for the first time in weeks. The sun broke through the clouds, scattering light across the harbor, turning the water to quicksilver. Jake stood as the lead technician emerged from the ship's hatch, his helmet tucked under his arm, his face gray with exhaustion. The man walked toward Agent Pierce, spoke quietly, then gestured for Jake to join them. "It's done," Pierce said simply. "The device is neutralized." Jake didn't realize he had been holding his breath until he felt his chest release. He nodded once, unable to speak. The technician offered a tired smile. "You were right to call it in, Mr. Carson. If that thing had been disturbed any further, it would have taken half the dock with it." Ranger barked once, short and sharp, as if punctuating the relief that rippled through the group. Jake bent down, scratching the dog's neck gently. "You hear that? We're still here." His voice was rough, the words catching somewhere between laughter and disbelief. The agents moved quickly after that. The bomb team cleared the area while another group carefully cataloged everything found inside the ship: the gold bars, the sealed crates, the faded documents. When one of them carried out the small metal box Jake had discovered, they placed it inside a reinforced case, as though it were sacred. Hours later, as the sun reached its peak, Agent Kelly approached with a folder in hand, his expression unreadable. "We've confirmed it," he said. "The materials inside that compartment match records from a European theft case, Berlin 1937. A bank robbery that vanished from official archives during the war. The stolen bonds resurfaced here on this ship." Jake frowned. "How's that possible?" Pierce answered quietly. "The documents suggest the Meridian was repurposed near the end of World War II to transport reconstruction assets. Somewhere along the way, someone, maybe Monroe, discovered the stolen bonds mixed in with the shipment. If this anchor organization was involved, he might have tried to stop them. That would explain the bomb." The name lingered between them like a shadow. "The anchor," Jake repeated softly. "He mentioned them in the letter, said they'd come again." Pierce nodded. "They won't be returning to this. This closes the Meridian case. The anchor network remains under investigation." The investigation spread over the next day. Specialists entered the ship with cameras, historians with gloves each handling the artifacts as if they were relics of a forgotten world. Jake stood apart watching strangers uncover what he had stumbled upon by accident or fate. Each photograph seemed to peel away the mystery until only facts remained. Yet, to him, the ship still breathed, still held something human beneath its layers of steel. Late that afternoon, an officer from the Treasury Department met with him by the dock. The man was polite, precise in speech, and carried an air of ceremony. "Mr. Carson," he began, handing Jake a document on behalf of the U.S. government. "We acknowledge your discovery and cooperation in the recovery of federal and international assets. By maritime and salvage law, you're entitled to a finder's commission, 5% of the total appraised value." Jake blinked, barely processing the words. 5%, he echoed. The officer nodded. "The recovered gold bonds and certificates are currently valued at approximately $20 million. Your share will be processed through official channels in phased disbursements after audit and custody verification." Jake stared at the water, the sunlight dancing on its surface. 20 million. He thought of the house he hadn't repaired, the debts, the years spent patching broken engines for small wages. He thought of Ranger, of long winters and quiet mornings. He had come here expecting rust and scrap, and instead found history and something that felt almost like redemption. "I didn't do it for money," he said finally. The officer smiled faintly. That's usually how the good ones start. Reporters began to appear later that evening, their cameras glinting like insects in the fading light. Jake avoided them, retreating to the edge of the dock where a ranger waited. He sat, one hand resting on the dog's back, watching as the agents loaded the last of the crates into an armored truck. The ship looked smaller now, stripped of her secrets, her steel bones reflecting the orange hue of sunset. Pierce approached one last time, offering his hand. "You know," he said, "you've helped close 2 unsolved cases at once, the missing wartime shipment and the anchor bonds." 80 years of silence finally ended. Jake shook his hand, his grip firm but wary. "Feels strange," he admitted. "Like waking something that didn't want to be found." Pierce nodded. "Maybe. But sometimes the truth has to surface no matter how deep it's buried." Jake looked out toward the horizon where the sea met the sky in a pale shimmer. "The truth," he murmured. "Yeah, it always finds a way up." The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of the tide against the hull. Ranger nudged his arm, and Jake smiled softly, his first real smile in days. For the first time in years, the world felt still not peaceful exactly, but honest. He breathed deeply the salt air filling his lungs and closed his eyes for a moment, letting the hum of the harbor sink into him. Then, somewhere behind them, a generator clicked off and the floodlights dimmed. The SS Meridian stood quiet again. Her decks washed in the amber glow of dusk, her story finally told, or so it seemed. Months passed before the noise faded. The media eventually moved on. The reporters stopped calling, and the old tugboat SS Meridian was dismantled and shipped to secure facilities for cataloging. But one part of her remained a piece Jake refused to let go. Under a long-term transfer of custody agreement, the main engine block, the heart of the ship, was delivered to his property on the edge of Clearwater, where the sea met a long strip of weathered docks. With his portion of the reward, he bought a small workshop by the coast. Nothing fancy, just a sturdy building with salt-stained windows and the soft hum of wind chimes at the door. The locals called it Carson Marine Restorations, though Jake never bothered to put up a large sign. He didn't want fame, he wanted purpose. The first thing he did was clean the engine block. It took him and 2 hired workers nearly a week to wash away the grime of decades. The metal beneath, once dull and wounded, gleamed faintly in the sunlight. He placed it in the center of the workshop, surrounded by a rope barrier like an artifact. Above it, on a simple wooden plaque, he engraved the words, "Himself." Not every secret should stay buried. When the last screw was tightened, he stood there for a long time, hands resting on the edge of the display, the reflection of light catching the tired lines in his face. Ranger sat at his side tail, thumping weakly against the floor. Life began to move with a gentler rhythm. Each morning, Jake unlocked the workshop as the horizon blushed gold. He would pour coffee into his old Navy mug, open the large bay doors, and let the smell of salt and fuel drift in. Ranger followed him everywhere, slower now, but stubbornly loyal. The dog's muzzle had gone almost white, and his steps were stiff from age, yet he still insisted on following Jake down the dock every sunrise. Together, they watched the fishing boats head out the gulls wheeling overhead. Sometimes Jake talked softly to him, recounting stories from years ago, missions gone wrong. Friends he never got to say goodbye to, and lately the ship that had changed both their lives. Word of his restoration work spread. Retired sailors, hobbyists, and small museum curators began to visit, bringing old compasses, damaged model ships, or relics from forgotten wrecks. Jake repaired them carefully, his movements steady and patient, as if each item carried its own quiet soul. People came expecting a business, but what they found felt more like a sanctuary. He never turned anyone away, and he never overcharged. He just said, "The sea remembers more than it forgets," and got to work. At the back of the workshop, he kept a small corner for Ranger, a padded bed, a water bowl, and a worn tennis ball the dog never chased anymore, but liked to keep nearby. Jake would smile, kneel beside him, and stroke the dog's neck. "You miss her too, don't you?" he'd whisper, meaning the Meridian. The engine, silent and polished, seemed to listen with them. Every so often, agents from the Naval History and Heritage Command sent letters updating him about the recovered assets, the archived documents, and the official commendation that had been approved in his name. He kept them in a drawer beneath the counter, unopened. He didn't need the praise or the papers. He already had what mattered. The nights were quiet now, sometimes too quiet. Jake would sit outside his workshop on an old folding chair, watching the tide creep in under the moonlight. Ranger would rest beside him, head on his boots. The sound of the waves against the pier reminded him of the heartbeat he had once felt through the deck of the Meridian. Some nights he could almost imagine hearing her again, a deep, low hum beneath the surface of the water, as if the ship were still speaking to him in its own language of steel and salt. He'd close his eyes, then letting the sound blend with the wind until it became part of the rhythm of his breathing. He thought often of Captain Elias Monroe, the man who had hidden the gold not out of greed, but conviction. He wondered if Monroe had ever found peace before his story ended. Sometimes Jake thought maybe they weren't so different, 2 men trying to save something from being lost to corruption, even if it meant bearing the silence that followed. One morning, a local newspaper asked if they could photograph the display in his shop. Jake agreed reluctantly. When the photographer finished, she asked about the plaque above the engine. "Not every secret should stay buried," she read aloud. "What does it mean to you?" Jake wiped his hands on a rag, glanced at Ranger dozing nearby, and said quietly, "It means some things are better when the truth finally sees daylight. But others belong to the deep." The article ran a week later, tucked in the community section under the title, "Veteran Turns Rust into History." It drew a few curious visitors, but Jake didn't mind. Most just stood quietly before the old engine reading the plaque, letting the hum of the sea fill the silence. That winter, the mornings grew colder. Jake wrapped his coat tighter, moving slower, but never missing a dawn. He and Ranger walked the same stretch of dock each day, two silhouettes etched against the sunrise, the man with his hands deep in his pockets, the dog with his head low, walking in step. The gulls circled overhead, crying softly, and the air smelled of salt oil and something like peace. One morning, the tide was higher than usual. The water lapped at the edges of the dock, glinting like glass in the early light. Jake stopped looking out toward the horizon. "You did good, old friend," he said softly. Ranger wagged his tail once, slow but sure. The wind carried their breath away, blending it with the steady sound of the sea. The days had grown shorter, the kind of winter days where the light faded before anyone was ready. Jake noticed how the air changed, first to the sharp bite of salt in the wind, the way the gulls flew lower over the water, slower, quieter. Clearwater had turned pale and cold, but it was still home. The sea remained steady, whispering the same rhythm. It always had a language Jake had learned to understand without words. Inside the workshop, the faint smell of oil and seawater lingered. The great engine of the SS Meridian stood polished and silent in its corner, its plaque gleaming faintly in the amber light. Not every secret should stay buried. Jake had grown used to that sight, though some days, when the sunlight hit just right, he could almost see the reflection of the captain's handwriting across its surface, faint like an echo. He took comfort in that, not fear. The ghosts here were gentle ones. That afternoon, the sky turned golden, and the last warmth of the day settled across the dock. Jake stepped outside, his hands tucked deep into the pockets of his jacket, and Ranger followed close behind. The dog was slower now, his gait uneven but determined. His fur had thinned and his breaths came softer, but his eyes still carried that quiet knowing, steady, loyal, full of life. They walked to the end of the pier the way they always did, each step creaking against the wood, the tide lapping gently below. The sun was lowering behind the lighthouse, the same lighthouse that had guided ships home for nearly a century. Its light blinked rhythmically across the water, a pulse against the darkening sea. Jake sat down on his usual spot, the edge of the dock where the world seemed to stretch forever. Ranger eased down beside him, his head finding its place on Jake's worn boot as naturally as breathing. Jake smiled faintly, running a hand through the dog's fur, feeling the rise and fall of his slow breathing. "You know," he said softly, his voice almost lost to the wind, "I used to think life was about fixing things. Machines, mistakes, the past. Turns out, some things aren't meant to be fixed. They're meant to be carried." He looked out toward the horizon, the sun dipping lower until it kissed the line of the sea. The light shimmered across the waves, turning them to molten gold. "We've done all right, you and me," he whispered. "Didn't we?" Boy Ranger stirred, opening his eyes halfway, and let out a quiet breath that sounded like agreement. Jake chuckled under his breath, the sound rough but warm. "Yeah, you always were the better man between us." He looked down at the dog, his expression softening. "You remember that night when we first stepped on that ship? You knew, didn't you? You always know when something's wrong. Maybe that's why we made it out." Ranger blinked slowly, the wind stirring his fur. Jake continued, his voice low and even. "I don't think I'll ever understand why we found that ship or why it found us, but I know this much. Whatever that gold was worth, whatever history came out of it, it's nothing compared to you, old friend. The real treasure was right here all along." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of the ocean through the air. Somewhere, a buoy bell rang in the distance, its hollow tone drifting across the bay. Jake tilted his head, listening. "You hear that?" he murmured. "Sounds like her, doesn't it? The Meridian. Still talking even after all this time." He imagined the ship beneath the waves, her bones resting in the dark at peace after decades of holding secrets too heavy for any man. The thought didn't sadden him anymore, it steadied him. Some stories ended quietly, like the tide easing back into the deep. The last light of the sun flared once more across the workshop windows. Jake's reflection shimmered faintly in the glass, and beside it, the outline of a ranger's head resting on his leg. They looked for a moment like two figures carved from time itself, a man and his dog, keeping watch over what was once lost and now found. He could feel the warmth of the fading light on his face, the pulse of the sea beneath him, and the steady weight of loyalty beside him. "You know," he said softly, his voice breaking into a whisper carried by the wind. "We never needed the gold. The rarest treasure, we already found it, loyalty." He smiled, then not the weary smile of an old man, but the quiet one of someone who had finally made peace with his ghosts. He reached down, his hand resting gently on Ranger's head, feeling the slow rhythm beneath his fingers. The sun slipped fully behind the lighthouse, the world turning silver blue in its wake. The beacon swept across the horizon, its light touching the waves, the dock, and the two of them sitting still against the fading day. The air grew colder, but Jake didn't move. The sea breathed around him, a slow, eternal sound, as if the Meridian herself was exhaling after all those years. The reflection of the lighthouse beam passed over the engine inside the workshop, glinting off the plaque before disappearing into shadow. On the far wall, the light briefly formed the shape of two figures, one upright one, seated low, etched in gold and rust. A man and his dog guarding the silence of the sea. Ranger sighed contentedly, eyes half closed, the rhythm of his breath syncing with the tide. Jake watched the last shimmer of sunlight dissolve into the horizon and whispered almost to himself, "We're home, now." The waves answered softly, folding over one another like pages closing a book. Above them, the light turned once more from the lighthouse, casting a long beam across the water. For a brief, perfect moment, the dock, the workshop, and the old engine all glowed with that same golden light, as if the past itself were nodding in quiet approval before sinking back into peace. If this story touched you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more true-hearted tales like this one. Tell me, where are you watching from? And which moment hit you hardest, the secret in the ship, or Jake and Ranger's bond that never broke? I'd love to hear your thoughts below.